Look, I've done this kind of work for 3 years now. Started at Green Lawn Cemetery, 2 years of dealing with voices in the fog and cold spots that had nothing to do with weather. Then 6 months at that toll booth on Route 40 where cars would show up with license plates from states that didn't exist anymore. Even handled the lighthouse gig up north, which, well, let's just say lighthouse keepers have good reasons for following very specific protocols about when to turn the light on and off. Point is, I know supernatural contract work. You get a list of rules, you follow them exactly, you collect your paycheck. Simple as that. The Westfield Plaza job seemed like easy money. $500 for 8 hours. Way more than the usual rate, but the property manager made it clear they'd had turnover issues. That's code for previous guards who couldn't handle the weird stuff. Their loss, my gain. I met Sullivan in the parking lot at 6 p.m. sharp. Punctuality matters in this line of work. The guy looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, kept checking his watch and shuffling papers around in his briefcase. Classic nervous manager type, probably never worked a night shift in his life. "Thank God you responded," he said, shaking my hand with sweaty palms. "Your resume, all that experience with unusual assignments." I let him talk. Sullivan was the kind of guy who felt better when he could categorize things, put them in neat little boxes. To him, I was the experienced contractor who could handle weird stuff box. That worked fine for me. The mall behind him looked like every other dead retail dinosaur I'd seen. Concrete facade streaked with rust stains, half the sign letters missing, parking lot full of weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Nothing special about it. Nothing that screamed supernatural hotspot. Should have paid more attention to how fast Sullivan wanted to leave. He handed me a manila folder, the old-fashioned kind with metal clasps, and started backing toward his car before I'd even opened it. Standard protocols inside. Shift runs 10 to 6. Demolition crew arrives at 7 a.m., so you just need to keep everything locked down until then. "Any particular issues I should know about?" I asked, but he was already climbing into his sedan. "All in the folder," he called through the window. "Good luck tonight." Gone before I could ask about building plans or emergency contacts. In 3 years of contract work, I'd never had a manager bail that fast. But hey, less supervision meant I could work my way without someone breathing down my neck. I opened the folder while leaning against my Honda. Westfield Plaza Security Protocols. Final Night Operations. Standard format, typewritten on what looked like an actual typewriter. Old school, but most supernatural contracts preferred analog communication. Something about digital interference, or so the theory went. 10 rules total. I read through them twice, making mental notes. Lock all entrances by 10:15 p.m. exactly. Radio checks every 30 minutes. Greet the night janitor politely. Apparently he'd been working there for years. Stand near the food court carousel at 2:15 a.m. for exactly 2 minutes. If the radio started getting static, turn it off for 2 minutes. Don't touch the mannequins because they were part of some art installation. Check the West Wing escalator at 2:15 a.m. to make sure it stayed powered off. Emergency exit protocol specified the south exit only. Remove all personal objects to a lockbox at 3 a.m. Final sweep at 5:30 a.m. Pretty straightforward stuff. The timing conflict between rules 4 and 7 jumped out. Couldn't be in 2 places at 2:15 a.m., but most contracts had clerical errors that got sorted out in practice. Probably Carousel took priority since it was listed first. I spent the next 3 hours getting familiar with the building layout, drove around the perimeter, noted exit locations, checked sight lines. The mall was smaller than it looked from outside. 2 levels, 4 wings radiating from a central courtyard with a fountain. Basic 1980s design, built when malls were still the heart of suburban commerce. The mannequins were interesting, scattered throughout the retail spaces in what did look like some kind of artistic installation. Not the usual commercial poses you'd expect. These were positioned like they'd been caught in the middle of normal activities. One reading a book in the bookstore window, another sitting on a bench near the fountain looking up at the skylight. Several more arranged in conversational groups throughout the clothing stores. Detailed work. Whoever set it up had put real thought into it. Seemed like a weird thing to install in a building scheduled for demolition, but artists do strange things for strange reasons. 10 p.m. Time to start the real work. I used the manager's key to get inside through the main entrance. Dead malls have their own particular smell. Industrial cleaning solution mixed with old carpet and that stagnant air you get in big empty spaces. The fountain was still running, though the water had turned an unappetizing shade of green. Security lighting cast long shadows between the empty storefronts. The lock protocol went smoothly. 10 entrances total, each one labeled and keyed separately. I worked methodically, testing each lock after securing it. Main doors, service entrances, emergency exits. Everything clicked into place like it was supposed to. 10:15 p.m. exactly. First rule completed. I lit a cigarette outside the south entrance before heading back in. Bad habit on these jobs where you needed to stay sharp, but it helped calm the nerves. The flame flickered weakly in the evening air, and I took a long drag, letting the smoke settle my thoughts. Security work was all about routine and attention to detail. The radio check at 10:30 went fine. Base station dispatcher sounded bored, confirmed my location and status. Westfield Plaza, all clear. Next check in 30. This was the part I was actually good at. The systematic execution of specific protocols in environments that spooked most people. You treat it like any other skilled trade. Learn the requirements, follow them precisely, stay alert for changes that might indicate problems. The mall was quieter than most abandoned buildings. No settling sounds, no wind through broken windows, no small animals scurrying around. Just the hum of basic electrical systems and my footsteps echoing off the terrazzo floors. Made it easy to focus on the work. I started my patrol routine, making note of details. The old terrazzo floor was cracked in places, with missing tiles creating dark gaps that seemed to absorb the security lighting. The walls still bore faded outlines where store signs had once been mounted, ghostly reminders of retail past. The air held a faint scent of mildew mixed with something acrid, probably burnt wiring from old electronics. The mannequins were positioned exactly where I'd seen them during my earlier survey. The one in the bookstore window faced toward the back of the store, both hands at its sides. The one on the bench sat with its legs crossed, head tilted up toward the skylight. The group in the clothing store seemed to be having a silent conversation, their poses suggesting mid-sentence interruption. Professional documentation was key. If something supernatural was happening, I'd need detailed records to identify patterns and develop appropriate responses. 11 p.m. radio check. All normal. As I walked past the fountain, I noticed the water wasn't just green. It was moving in slow, irregular patterns, despite the lack of any visible circulation system. Probably some underground pump still functioning, though why anyone would keep it running in an abandoned building was beyond me. I made a note in my log anyway. Everything got documented in this line of work. 11:15 p.m., second patrol circuit. That's when I noticed the first change. The mannequin in the bookstore window was facing the corridor now, hands positioned differently too, one raised like it was waving, the other at its side. I stopped and stared at it for a full minute, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I'd documented earlier. I pulled out my notebook. My handwriting was clear. Bookstore window, figure facing away from corridor, both hands at sides. Building settling maybe, old foundation, temperature changes, mannequin shifting on its base. Physics, not supernatural. I'd seen weirder things explained by perfectly normal causes. The lighthouse job taught me not to jump to supernatural conclusions for stuff that could be basic problem solving. But this felt different. Not the casual wrongness you get in old buildings with history. This felt deliberate, aware. I made a note. 11:18 p.m. Mannequin position appears to have changed. Continue monitoring. The thing was, I could swear it was looking at me now, not just facing the corridor, looking directly at me through the storefront glass. The painted eyes seemed to track my movement as I walked past. Trick of the lighting, probably. Security floods casting shadows at weird angles, making static poses seem more dynamic than they actually were. I'd seen the same effect in the cemetery, headstone angels that seemed to follow you with their eyes until you changed your viewing angle and realized it was just clever Victorian sculpture work. Still made the back of my neck prickle. 11:30 p.m. radio check went normally, but I found myself rushing through the routine. Wanted to get back to my patrol, keep an eye on things. The mannequin was still in its new position, still seemed to be watching me. I walked past it 3 times, approaching from different angles, trying to break the illusion. Didn't work. The thing's gaze followed me every time. The mall's HVAC system cycled on with a mechanical wheeze, pushing stale air through decades-old ductwork. The sound echoed strangely in the empty corridors, almost like whispered conversation carried on the artificial breeze. I paused, listening carefully. Nothing but machinery and my own breathing. By 11:45 p.m., I was starting to feel like I was being studied. Not just by the one in the bookstore window, by all of them. The whole installation had taken on a different quality, like a room full of people pretending to be asleep while you walked through it. The rational part of my brain kept offering explanations. Old building, unfamiliar environment, too much coffee before starting the shift. Perfectly normal psychological responses to working alone in a large empty space. But 3 years of supernatural contract work had taught me to trust my instincts while maintaining professional skepticism. Something was wrong here. Maybe not supernatural wrong, not yet, but definitely not normal security work either. I completed my midnight radio check and settled in for what was looking like a very long night. The mannequins hadn't moved again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a mistake. The midnight radio check should have been routine. Base station, status report, confirmation. Standard stuff I'd done hundreds of times across different jobs. But when I keyed the mic at exactly 12 a.m., static erupted from the speaker like someone had jammed a fork into an electrical socket. Harsh, white noise that made my teeth ache. I pulled the radio away from my ear, checked the frequency settings. Everything looked normal. The static kept going, loud enough that I worried it might wake up half the neighborhood if there'd been anyone around to hear it. Rule 5. If you hear static on the radio, turn it off for 2 minutes. Simple enough. I switched the radio off and checked my watch. 12:01 a.m. 2 minutes of silence, then back to normal operations. Except during those 2 minutes, I heard other things. Footsteps echoing from the upper level. Slow, measured steps like someone walking a patrol route. But I was the only security guard on duty. The sound moved from the north wing toward the east, following what would be a logical security path if there was actually someone up there. Then laughter. Faint but clear, coming from somewhere near the fountain. Not malicious laughter, more like people having a conversation, the kind of casual chuckling you'd hear in a restaurant or coffee shop. Almost made me feel nostalgic for when this place was still alive. And voices. Distant enough that I couldn't make out words, but definitely human voices. Multiple people talking over each other, like a crowd noise you'd hear through a wall. All in a building that was supposed to be completely empty, except for me. 12:03 a.m. Time to turn the radio back on. The static was gone. Base station came through clear as day when I called in my status. Westfield Plaza, all clear. Small radio issue, but resolved now. Copy that. Everything else normal? I almost mentioned the sounds during the blackout period. Almost. But 3 years of supernatural contract work had taught me that base station dispatchers didn't want to hear about the weird stuff. They wanted confirmation that you were alive and the building was secure. Everything else was just details that made their paperwork more complicated. All normal, I said. Lie number 1. The patrol after the radio incident felt different. The mannequins were all in the same positions, but the mall itself seemed more aware somehow. Like it had been testing me with the static protocol, seeing how I'd react to the first real deviation from normal operations. I started paying closer attention to details. The fountain water was moving in more complex patterns now, forming little whirlpools that appeared and disappeared without any obvious cause. The security lighting seemed dimmer, though the bulbs were all working. Even my footsteps sounded different. Less echo, more absorption, like the building was swallowing sound. 1 a.m. Time for my third major patrol circuit. That's when I found out the mannequins weren't just shifting positions, they were actively moving. The one that had been reading in the bookstore window was gone entirely. The book was still there, lying open on the display table, but the figure itself had vanished. I spent 5 minutes searching the store, checking behind counters and in the back room, but nothing. The one from the bench near the fountain had moved to the clothing store, where it now stood with the conversational group. 4 figures instead of 3, all posed like they were having an animated discussion about something urgent. But here's what really got to me. I found a new mannequin in the bookstore window. Different face, different hair, different pose entirely. This one was looking directly out at the corridor, one hand pressed against the glass like it was trying to get my attention. I pulled out my notebook and checked my previous entries. According to my documentation, there should be 3 mannequins total in the clothing store area, 1 on the bench and 1 in the bookstore. My count was exactly right. But the individual figures were completely different from what I'd recorded. Mathematical impossibility. Either my documentation was wrong, or mannequins were moving around when I wasn't looking. And my documentation was never wrong. I decided to run a test. Found a handful of loose change in my pocket, quarters and dimes from the vending machine outside my apartment. Placed 1 coin at the base of each mannequin I could find, positioning them carefully so I'd know if anything shifted even slightly. 12 mannequins total throughout the mall, 12 coins marking their exact positions. If these things were moving on their own, I'd have proof within the hour. 1:30 a.m. radio check went normally. Base station confirmed my status, no problems reported. But I was starting to feel paranoid about the whole communication system. What if base station wasn't real? What if I was just talking to some automated system designed to make me think I had backup? Stupid thought, paranoid thinking, the kind of mental spiral that got security guards fired from normal jobs and killed on supernatural ones. 2 a.m., time to check my experiment. 8 of the 12 coins were gone. Not moved, gone. Vanished completely, like they'd never existed. The mannequins were in subtly different positions, a turned head here, a shifted arm there, a change in weight distribution that was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The 4 coins that remained were under mannequins that hadn't moved at all. Perfect correlation. Whatever was happening, it was systematic, controlled. I started collecting the remaining coins, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the food court. I turned around, but the corridor was empty. The sound continued anyway. Footsteps without a person, moving at a casual walking pace toward the central fountain area. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped. 5 seconds of perfect silence. Then a voice answered from somewhere near the fountain. "Good evening." Elderly male voice, polite, friendly tone. Exactly the kind of greeting you'd expect from a long-time employee who was used to working nights. The janitor. Rule 3. Always greet the night janitor politely when encountered. I walked toward the voice and found him near the fountain. Older guy, maybe 70s, wearing a gray maintenance uniform and pushing a mop bucket on wheels. The bucket was full of soapy water that smelled like industrial pine cleaner. He was methodically mopping the terrazzo floor in slow, careful strokes. "Good evening," I replied. Didn't expect anyone else to be working tonight. He looked up and nodded, but didn't say anything else. Just went back to mopping. His movements were efficient, practiced, like someone who'd been doing this job for decades. The water in his bucket was actually clean, which struck me as odd since most janitors in abandoned buildings were dealing with dust and debris, not the kind of dirt that required fresh soap solution. I watched him work for a minute, trying to figure out what felt wrong about the scene. The uniform looked authentic. The equipment was standard industrial janitorial stuff. His technique was professional and thorough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a performance rather than actual work. "Been working here long?" I asked. He paused in his mopping and looked at me with pale blue eyes. "Many years," he said, "since the beginning." Then he went back to his work, dismissing me politely but clearly. I took the hint and continued my patrol, leaving him to clean floors that would be demolished in 5 hours. 2:15 a.m. approached, and I had a problem. Rule 4. Stand near the food court carousel at 2:15 a.m. for exactly 2 minutes. Rule 7. Check the West Wing escalator at 2:15 a.m. Ensure it remains powered off. Same time. 2 different locations. Physically impossible to do both. I stood in the central corridor, looking toward the food court in one direction and the West Wing in the other, maybe 100 yards between them. Even if I sprinted, I couldn't cover both locations in the same 2-minute window. This was the kind of clerical error that usually got sorted out through common sense and professional judgment. The carousel rule seemed more specific: exact timing, exact duration. The escalator check sounded like general safety verification that could probably be done a few minutes early or late without problems. I chose the carousel. The food court was darker than the rest of the mall, with most of the overhead lighting either broken or switched off. The carousel sat in the center of the space, a small kiddie ride with painted horses and circus animals. It had been covered with a plastic tarp, but someone had pulled the covering aside, exposing the faded paint and chipped fiberglass. 2:15 a.m. I stood next to the carousel as instructed. Nothing happened for the first minute. Just me and a bunch of plastic horses in a dead food court, feeling slightly ridiculous. But during the second minute, the carousel started making sounds. Not mechanical sounds, music, faint calliope melody, the kind of tinny circus music that kiddie rides played to attract customers. But the ride wasn't moving. No power, no motion, just the music playing from speakers that should have been disconnected months ago. The melody was wrong, too. Too slow, with notes that bent and warped like the music was being played through water. It sounded less like entertainment and more like a funeral dirge. 2:17 a.m. 2 minutes completed. Time to check on the West Wing. That's when I heard the crash. Loud, echoing sound of something heavy hitting the floor came from the direction of the West Wing escalator, exactly where I should have been standing according to Rule 7. The carousel music stopped abruptly, like someone had yanked the power cord. I ran toward the West Wing, flashlight in hand, radio ready to call for backup if needed. The crash had been loud enough to wake the dead, and in a building this size, sound carried from a long way off. The West Wing escalator was running. That was impossible. The escalator had been switched off and barricaded with caution tape when I'd done my initial survey. Now the steps were moving upward at normal speed, and the caution tape was hanging in shreds like someone had torn through it. Worse, there was debris on the floor. Ceiling tiles, chunks of drywall, a few pieces of metal scaffolding that looked like they'd fallen from a significant height. Fresh damage, still settling. My flashlight beam caught something else. Wet footprints leading away from the escalator toward the upper level. Size 11 boots, same as mine. Recent enough that the water hadn't evaporated yet, but I hadn't been anywhere near the West Wing escalator tonight. I tried the radio. Base station, this is Westfield Plaza. We have a possible break-in situation. West Wing escalator has been activated without authorization. Static. Then the voice came through clear. Copy that, Westfield. Are you requesting immediate backup? Negative. Investigating now. We'll report back in 10 minutes. I should have requested backup. That was the smart play. But 3 years of supernatural contract work had taught me that backup usually meant regular security guards who didn't understand the specialized nature of these jobs. They'd show up, find nothing obviously wrong, and file a report that made me look like I was seeing things. Better to handle it myself and document everything properly. The mall's old security office was on the first level, equipped with a bank of monitors that supposedly covered all the major sight lines. Most of them were dark, but 3 screens still showed grainy black and white feeds from cameras that were apparently still functional. I rewound the footage, looking for evidence of whoever had activated the escalator. The timestamp showed 2:15 a.m. exactly. The West Wing camera captured everything. At 2:15 a.m., the escalator was off and the caution tape was intact. At 2:15:30, a figure appeared at the bottom of the escalator. At 2:16:15, the figure cut through the caution tape and activated the escalator. At 2:16:45, ceiling debris started falling as the escalator mechanism engaged. At 2:17 a.m., the figure disappeared from the camera's field of view. But here's what made my hands shake as I watched the playback. The figure on the security footage was wearing the same black security uniform I was wearing. Same build, same height, same movement patterns. The footage showed me activating the escalator at exactly the time I was supposed to be standing by the carousel. 2:45 a.m. Time to make sense of what was happening. I pulled out my notebook to review the rules again, looking for some explanation of the timing conflict that would help me understand how to handle the rest of the shift. That's when I discovered the real problem. Rule 5 had changed. Where it had originally read, "Turn it off for 2 minutes," the text now clearly stated, "Turn it off for 5 minutes." Same typewriter font, same paper, same everything. But definitely different content. I stared at the page trying to convince myself that I'd misread it earlier, but I had a good memory for details, and I specifically remembered thinking that 2 minutes seemed like a short duration for a radio blackout protocol. I checked the other rules. Small changes throughout, subtle but consistent. Rule 3 now specified greeting the janitor respectfully instead of politely. Rule 6 mentioned sculptural installation instead of art installation. Rule 9 had changed the time from 3 a.m. to 3:15 a.m. Either I was losing my mind or something was rewriting my instructions in real time. 3 a.m. approached and I had to make a choice. Follow the rules as they appeared now, or follow what I remembered from my original reading. The safe play was to assume my memory was faulty and follow the current text, but professional security work was built on attention to detail and accurate documentation. If I couldn't trust my own notes, I couldn't trust anything. I decided to follow my memory and ignore the changed text. Wrong choice, as it turned out. But I wouldn't understand that until later. By 3 a.m., I was starting to realize that this wasn't a standard supernatural contract job. The rules weren't just guidelines for staying safe in a haunted building. They were part of something actively malicious that was using my own expertise against me. The mall wanted me to fail, and it was getting smarter about how to make that happen. 3 a.m. Time for the object removal protocol. Rule 9 was clear. Remove all personal objects to the security office lockbox at 3 a.m. exactly. Phone, keys, anything that might interfere with final systems checks. I'd questioned the logic during my initial rule review, but supernatural contracts often had equipment restrictions that didn't make obvious sense until later. The security office was a cramped space behind the information kiosk, equipped with basic monitoring equipment and a heavy steel lockbox bolted to the floor. Standard industrial security setup, the kind you'd find in any commercial building. The lockbox opened with a key from my main ring, simple mechanical lock, nothing electronic that could malfunction. I emptied my pockets methodically. Phone, car keys, apartment keys, wallet, loose change, my backup flashlight. Everything went into the lockbox except my primary flashlight, radio, and the notebook with the rules. Those were work equipment, not personal objects. The lockbox clicked shut with a solid mechanical sound. Key went back on my ring, and I was officially disconnected from the outside world. No way to call for backup. No way to leave the building until my shift ended. Just me, the rules, and whatever was lurking in the shadows between the storefronts. I should have felt more vulnerable without my phone. Instead, I felt oddly relieved. One less thing to worry about. One less potential distraction from the increasingly complex task of staying alive until sunrise. That relief lasted exactly 15 minutes. 3:15 a.m. I was walking past the fountain when I felt something hard and metallic in my jacket pocket. The same pocket I'd just emptied into the lockbox. My hand closed around a small object, flat, circular, about the size of a silver dollar. I pulled it out and examined it under my flashlight beam. Some kind of medallion or token made from tarnished brass or bronze. One side showed an embossed image of the mall's central fountain. The other side had a symbol I didn't recognize, interlocking circles with lines radiating outward like a stylized sun. At the bottom, barely legible text, Westfield Plaza, final night. Commemorative token, maybe. Tourist souvenir from the mall's early days. Except I was absolutely certain it hadn't been in my pocket when I'd emptied everything into the lockbox. My pockets had been completely empty, which meant something had placed this object on me during the past 15 minutes, while I was alone in the building, while I was following my patrol route through corridors that offered clear sight lines in every direction. I was now in violation of Rule 9 through no action of my own. The mall was cheating. 3:20 a.m. I tried to retrace my steps, figure out when and where someone could have slipped the token into my pocket without me noticing. The security cameras might have caught something, but the footage from earlier had shown me in 2 places at once. Not exactly reliable evidence. That's when I saw the janitor again. Same gray maintenance uniform, same mop bucket, same slow methodical movements. But something was wrong with his face. The features were subtly different, eyes a little closer together, nose slightly more prominent, jawline changed just enough to trigger uncanny valley discomfort, like someone had tried to recreate the previous janitor from memory and gotten most of the details right, but not quite all of them. "Good evening," I said, following Rule 3. He looked up from his mopping and smiled. The expression didn't fit his face properly, like he was wearing a mask that was slightly the wrong size. "You shouldn't have said hello, Reeve." My blood went cold. I'd never given my name to anyone at the mall. The property manager had known it from my resume, but we'd met in the parking lot. No one inside the building should have that information. "How do you know my name?" The janitor's smile got wider, showing too many teeth. "I know lots of things about you, Reeve. I know you worked at Greenlawn Cemetery for 2 years. I know you handled the lighthouse gig that nobody else would take. I know you think you're smarter than the people who came before you." He dipped his mop in the bucket and continued cleaning, like having a conversation about my employment history was the most natural thing in the world. "Who are you?" I asked. "Just the janitor. Been working here for many years, since the beginning." Same words as before, but his voice sounded different, younger, more amused. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on him. The beam revealed something that made my stomach clench. The water in his mop bucket wasn't cleaning solution anymore. It was dark red, thick and viscous, and it smelled like old copper pennies. Blood. He was mopping the floor with blood. "Rule violation noted," he said without looking up from his work. "Personal objects in possession after 3 a.m. consequences will follow shortly." I turned and ran. 3:30 a.m. The mannequins were no longer pretending to be still. I'd made it halfway back to the central corridor when I saw the first one moving. Not the subtle position changes I'd been tracking all night. Actual movement. Walking with stiff, deliberate steps across the terrazzo floor. The figure from the bookstore window was heading directly toward me, its painted eyes fixed on my face. Behind it, 3 more mannequins emerged from various storefronts, all moving in the same mechanical way. No attempt at hiding their motion anymore. I dodged left toward the north wing, but found my path blocked by 2 more figures that had somehow gotten ahead of me. They stood perfectly still, arms at their sides but positioned to prevent me from reaching the food court area. Right toward the west wing, blocked, straight ahead toward the fountain. 3 mannequins forming a loose semicircle, herding me like sheep. They were forcing me toward the south wing, the area with the emergency exit mentioned in Rule 8. But I was still 3 hours away from shift end, and I had a growing suspicion that following their guidance would be a fatal mistake. I tried to push past the 2 blocking the north wing path. The moment I got within arm's reach, one of them moved. Quick, precise motion, grabbing my wrist with fiberglass fingers that felt like cold concrete. "Rule violation," it said in a voice like grinding gears. "Consequences initiated." I yanked my arm free and stumbled backward. Where the mannequin had touched me, my skin burned like I'd been splashed with acid. The sleeve of my uniform shirt was smoking. More mannequins were emerging from storefronts throughout the mall, a dozen, then 2 dozen, then too many to count, all moving with the same stiff gait, all converging on the central corridor where I stood frozen in the middle of an impossible situation. 4 a.m. That's when the walls started talking. New text appeared as I watched, wet black letters forming on the white-painted walls like someone was writing with fresh ink, but there was no one holding a pen. The words just materialized, dripping slightly as they dried. Do not ignore the notebook. The message stretched across the storefront window where the first mannequin had been positioned. Below it, more text appeared. Rule 11. Face the fountain at 4:15. Then on the floor, spelled out in scattered black letters that looked like they'd been painted with a shaking hand. You cannot win by not playing. Similar messages appeared throughout the mall. On pillars, on the floor, written across the glass doors of empty shops. All in the same dripping black substance that smelled like burnt metal when I got close enough to examine it. The mannequins had stopped moving, but they remained positioned throughout the corridor system like chess pieces controlling the board. I could navigate between them, but only along paths they allowed. Every route they blocked led away from the fountain. Every route they left open led toward it. They were herding me toward whatever was waiting at 4:15 a.m. I pulled out my notebook to check if Rule 11 had been there all along. The pages felt different under my fingers, thicker, more substantial. And there it was, written in the same typewriter font as the other rules. Rule 11. Position yourself at the central fountain at 4:15 a.m. and face the water for exactly 1 minute. This ensures proper transition protocols. I was absolutely certain that rule hadn't existed when I'd read the list earlier, but the paper looked authentic. The formatting matched perfectly, and my memory had already proven unreliable when it came to the changing text. 4:10 a.m. 5 minutes to make a choice. Follow the new rule and face whatever was waiting at the fountain, or try to find another way to survive until sunrise. But the mannequins had effectively removed all other options. Every corridor except the path to the fountain was blocked by silent figures with burning fingers. I could try to fight my way through them, but the brief contact with the first one had left chemical burns on my wrist. Physical confrontation seemed like a guaranteed way to end up in the emergency room, assuming I survived long enough to get there. Professional assessment. I was out of options. 4:15 a.m. I stood at the edge of the fountain and looked down into the water. The green algae was gone. The water was crystal clear now, clear enough to see straight to the bottom. And in that artificial clarity, I saw images forming like photographs developing in a dark room. Previous security guards, all wearing the same black uniform I was wearing, all standing in the same position I was standing now. Different faces, different ages, but the same expression of growing horror as they realized what was happening to them. I watched them follow the same rules I'd been following, saw them discover the same timing conflicts, the same impossible choices, the same systematic undermining of everything that should have kept them safe. And I saw how each one failed. One guard tried to ignore the rules entirely and was found the next morning in the fountain, drowned in 2 feet of water. Another guard followed every rule perfectly, but made the mistake of trusting the south exit during an emergency. The door led to a basement level that didn't exist on any building plan. A third guard lasted almost until sunrise before violating the object removal protocol. He was discovered by the demolition crew, aged 20 years overnight, clutching a small metal token in his dead hand. The same token that was currently burning a hole in my jacket pocket. The images kept coming, showing me failed escape attempts, wrong decisions, fatal mistakes. Each guard had brought their own expertise to the job. Each one had approached the challenge with professional competence and systematic thinking, and each one had been defeated by something that learned from their methods and used their own skills against them. This wasn't a security job. It was a feeding process. The mall was something that consumed expertise itself, draining the confidence and professional competence out of people who thought they could handle supernatural situations, and it preferred experienced contractors because they provided a richer meal. 4:16 a.m. The water images faded, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the clear water. But the reflection was wrong. It showed me writing in a notebook, documenting something with careful attention to detail. I looked down at my actual notebook, but I wasn't writing anything. The reflection kept writing anyway, filling page after page with text I couldn't read from my angle. When it finished, it looked up at me and smiled. Then, my real notebook felt heavier in my hands. I opened it to find a new page, written in my own handwriting. Perfect penmanship, the same style I'd developed over years of security documentation. Final rule: use south exit at exactly 6 a.m. for safety. Trust no other instructions. This is the only way to ensure survival until demolition begins. I had absolutely no memory of writing those words, but the handwriting was unmistakably mine, better than mine actually, like someone had studied my penmanship and perfected it. The mall had learned to forge not just my writing, but my decision-making process. It knew exactly how I would phrase a rule if I was writing instructions for my own survival. 4:45 a.m., less than 2 hours until sunrise, and I finally understood what I was really fighting against. Not a haunted building or a supernatural entity following its own alien logic. This was something that had evolved specifically to hunt people like me. Something that used the familiar format of rules jobs as a delivery system for psychological torture, breaking down professional competence through systematic gaslighting and impossible choices. My expertise wasn't protection. It was the weapon being used against me. The mannequins began moving again, forming a loose circle around the fountain. Not threatening this time, just waiting for me to make the final mistake that would complete whatever process had been started when I first walked through those doors. But I still had time, still had options. Or at least, I hoped I did. 5 a.m. The mall wasn't just a building anymore. It was a predator, an ancient intelligence that had been feeding on people like me for God knows how long. The PA system crackled to life through speakers I hadn't noticed before, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, hidden in ceiling tiles and behind broken storefronts. The voice that emerged was layered, distorted, like multiple recordings of the same person speaking at slightly different speeds. "Welcome back, Reeve. You've made it farther than most, but the real game is just beginning." My radio felt slick in my sweating palm. Every second dragged like an hour, each tick of my watch echoing in the unnatural silence between the voice's words. Dawn was coming, but I was starting to understand that sunrise might not mean safety. This thing had been patient enough to wait 8 hours. What was another few minutes if it meant finishing the job properly? The mannequins were no longer pretending to be stationary. They moved through the corridors like a coordinated army, their fiberglass limbs clicking against the terrazzo floors. Some walked normally, others glided with that unsettling smoothness that made my skin crawl. They weren't trying to hide their motion anymore. The game had moved past subtlety. Fluorescent lights strobed overhead, casting everything in stuttering black and white snapshots. The air itself felt thick, charged with malevolent electricity that made my teeth ache. Even breathing was getting harder, like the building was slowly consuming all the oxygen. This wasn't supernatural contract work anymore. This was survival horror. 5:15 a.m. Every rule in my notebook had become a weapon pointed at my throat. The PA system vomited contradictory commands from every direction. One voice shouted to use the north exit immediately. Another screamed that the north exit would kill me instantly. A third insisted there had never been a north exit, that I was losing my mind. Escalators roared to life without warning, some carrying loads of debris that crashed and scattered when they reached the top. Others ran backward, or sideways, or at angles that defied physics. The West Wing escalator was somehow running vertically now, carrying mannequins up the wall like some kind of nightmare conveyor belt. My radio crackled with static-laden commands that changed before I could process them. Proceed to avoid the fountain at all. Rule 12 requires immediate. The fragments made no sense individually, and even less sense together. I threw the radio across the corridor. It shattered against a storefront window, the battery compartment exploding open, and sending AA batteries rolling across the floor like desperate metal insects. No more protocols, no more systematic thinking. Everything I'd learned in 3 years of supernatural contract work was useless here. Worse than useless, it was actively being used to manipulate me. I had to stop thinking like a security professional and start thinking like prey. The mannequins were hurting me, I realized. Every path they blocked, every corridor they left open, was pushing me toward a specific destination. They wanted me to go somewhere particular, and they were willing to be obvious about it now that we were so close to the end. 5:30 a.m. The final sweep. Rule 10. This was supposed to be a routine security walkthrough before the demolition crew arrived. Instead, it felt like walking through the digestive system of something that was slowly breaking me down for consumption. The mannequins had formed a loose corridor leading from the central fountain toward the south wing, not blocking, not threatening, just guiding. Like ushers at a theater, politely indicating where I should sit for the final performance. Every other path was impassable. Debris had somehow accumulated in impossible quantities. Chunks of concrete, twisted metal beams, shattered glass that formed foot-deep drifts across the floor. Some of the wreckage was clearly from the building itself, but other pieces looked foreign. I saw parts of cars, fragments of what might have been playground equipment, even what looked like pieces of other buildings entirely. The mall was digesting more than just security guards, I realized. This thing had been feeding for a long time. The corridor leading south was pristine. Clean floors, working lights, even the air smelled better. It was an obvious trap, but it was also the only way forward. The mannequins watched with their painted eyes as I walked between them, close enough to touch but making no aggressive moves. They didn't need to threaten me anymore. We all knew where this was heading. The south exit loomed ahead, the one my forged notebook entry had insisted was the only safe way out. Emergency exit protocol, use only in case of danger, the key to survival. Every instinct I'd developed in 3 years of supernatural work screamed that this was wrong, that the safe option was always the trap. But what choice did I have? 5:45 a.m. That's when I found the ladder. Pure luck, or maybe the mall's overconfidence, but I spotted it. A loose ceiling panel near the south exit, hanging slightly open with decades of dust spilling from the gap like gray snow. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, were metal rungs leading upward. Emergency service ladder. Building maintenance access to the roof. Not mentioned in any rules, not part of any protocol. Either the mall hadn't thought to account for it, or this was another layer of the trap I hadn't figured out yet. But it was the only option that didn't involve trusting something the building wanted me to do. The mannequins hadn't noticed yet. They were focused on the south exit, positioned to watch me walk through the door they'd spent all night herding me toward. I had maybe 30 seconds before they realized what I was doing. I pushed the ceiling panel aside and grabbed the first rung. The metal was cold, slick with decades of moisture and neglect. Rust flakes rained down as I climbed, staining my uniform and filling my mouth with the taste of oxidized iron. Each rung felt like it might pull loose from the wall, but they held. Below, I could hear the mannequins realizing I'd gone off script. Clicking sounds like dozens of ceramic figurines being knocked together, scraping noises as they repositioned themselves, a collective sigh that might have been disappointment or might have been anticipation. The ladder went up farther than I'd expected, past the second floor, past what should have been the roof access. The building was taller inside than outside, another impossible geometry that made my head spin. The air got thinner as I climbed, but also cleaner, like I was finally getting away from whatever poison the mall had been feeding me all night. My arms burned. My hands were slippery with sweat and blood from where the rough metal had torn my palms. But I kept climbing because stopping meant going back down, and going back down meant facing whatever was waiting at the bottom. 6 a.m. dawn. I pushed through a final hatch and found myself on the actual roof of the building. Real roof under real sky, with honest sunlight painting the horizon orange and gold. The fresh air hit my lungs like a drug, clean and cold and completely free of the supernatural malevolence that had been suffocating me for the past 8 hours. From up here, I could see the demolition crew setting up in the parking lot. Yellow hard hats, orange safety vests, normal people doing normal work in the normal world. They had no idea what they were about to tear down. No idea what had been living in the spaces between the storefronts, feeding on the confidence and competence of people who thought they understood how dangerous things worked. The mall stretched out below me, looking smaller and more ordinary in the morning light. Just a dead building, scheduled for destruction. The mannequins were probably still down there, waiting by the south exit for me to complete the script they'd written. But the performance was over. The audience of one had left the theater. I stayed on that roof until the first wrecking ball hit the north wall, watched the concrete crumble and the steel beams bend like cheap plastic. Whatever intelligence had been living in the Westfield Plaza, it died with the building. I felt it go, a sudden absence, like pressure releasing from my ears. The demolition crew found me an hour later, sunburned and dehydrated, but alive. I told them I'd been doing a final security sweep when my radio failed, couldn't find a way out in the dark, decided to wait for sunrise on the roof. They bought it. Security guards getting locked in abandoned buildings wasn't exactly unprecedented, but I knew better. 3 months later, I still can't take another rules job. The Westfield Plaza changed me in ways that went deeper than just professional confidence. It burned away my faith in systematic thinking, in the idea that expertise and experience could protect you from things that didn't follow human logic. I tried going back to regular security work, shopping centers, office buildings, normal places with normal threats. But every protocol feels like a trap waiting to spring. Every routine check makes me wonder if I'm being herded towards something worse. The supernatural contract community is small. Word gets around. Other contractors started sharing stories about jobs that felt wrong, places that seemed designed specifically to break experienced operators. The Westfield Plaza wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern. Something out there is learning from our methods, studying how we think, how we operate, how we survive. And it's getting better at using our own skills against us. In this line of work, being too good at the game doesn't make you safe. It makes you a target. And the thing that scares me most? I think we taught them everything they know about hunting people like us. The mall is gone, but the lessons it learned are spreading. Other places are adopting its tactics. And next time, they might not be satisfied with just one security guard per night.